conference will proceed with Dr. Erik Gomez-Baggethun's keynote speech. After briefly introducing Dr. Gomez-Baggethun, I will leave the platform to him. Erik Gomez-Baggethun is a professor of environmental governance at Norwegian University of Life Sciences, senior scientific advisor at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, and the senior visiting research associate at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on ecological economics and environmental policy, themes in which he has published many articles and book chapters for international journals and edited volumes. Today, we are really honored to listen to Dr. Erik with a presentation titled The Links Between Urban Green Space and Quality of Life in Cities. Dr. Erik, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Hishre. Thank you very much. And let me please first express my gratitude to the conference organizers. It's an honor for me to be here sharing my work with you. Thank you also for those of you who are listening. I'm a very old-fashioned person, not very fit to this digital time. So I really usually need to see the energy in the eyes of the people I'm talking to in order to adapt and to get feedback to a conference. It's the first keynote speech I will give online. So I hope it will work well. As Hishre already advanced, we will talk now about the link between urban green spaces and quality of life in cities. Okay. Let me show you very briefly how I have organized this speech. I will introduce a little bit the framing of the problem, and then I will introduce the idea of a concept that may be familiar to many of you, maybe not for all of you, that is increasingly used to understand the links between humans and nature, is the concept of ecosystem services, also known in the new jargon coined by the Intergovernmental Platform of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, also called Nature's Contributions to People. I will explain briefly what this is and how it can be used in order to reveal and analyze the links between humans and nature in urban environments and beyond. And then I will put some examples on how myself and my research groups have been applying or putting this framework into practice in order to inform sustainability policies and urban planning. And in the end, I will finish with a small set of concluding remarks. Let me start by telling something that maybe is the same introduction in half of the presentations you have heard so far, which is the idea of urbanization as one of the main driving forces of the Anthropocene. That term we used to refer to an era of human development where, according to many authors, is no longer geological forces, as it has always been in the past, the main driver force of planetary change. For the first time, it would be humans, the ones that have become the main force behind global environmental change. Well, among the many drivers of global change in the Anthropocene, one of the most prominent ones is urbanization. Is one of the heaviest processes of transformation we're experiencing over the last decades. Okay. Some of you will be familiar with this data from 2007. For the first time in human history, we have more people living in cities than people living in the countryside. Okay, 3,000 additional million people are expected to be living in cities by 2050. Why is this relevant background information for the sake of our discussion today? Well, basically because as more and more people live in cities, more and more people live away from direct contact with ecological dynamics, okay? We live in cities which are built environments dominated by concrete, by glass, by technology, and we have a limited contact with ecosystems, with dynamics, with temporal rhythms of nature. Some people have made the hypothesis that leads to the so-called extinction of experience. This is an idea introduced in the 1970s, but revisited once and again, and we have special issues being published over the last years around this idea that basically makes the hypothesis, advances the hypothesis that as more and more people live in cities away from natural processes, we lose awareness of our links to nature and of the many ways in which humans and human societies, but also our economies, depends on nature and on nature as a sort of ecological foundation of human life and also our economy. I'm giving this background information because I want to start my speech today by dispelling one, I would say, of the most widespread and most established myths in modern industrial societies. Namely, the idea that technology has basically emancipated humans from our traditional dependence on nature. No? We tend to think of the past as, you know, people always exposed to the calamities of nature for having food and so on. And now, thank you to technological development and so on, urbanization, built infrastructure, we have able to emancipate ourselves from our traditional dependence on nature. Well, the first message I want to give here is that is a myth, that is a false assumption, okay? It's true that we do not depend on nature on the same way we did in the past. Those of us who live in cities do not depend on nature on the same way of those small-scale societies of the past that took the fish from the seawaters they had, the water bodies they had around them, or the forests that were surrounding them. But that we depend on nature in a different way doesn't mean that we depend on nature less today than we did in the past, okay? If we look at the empirical data in the topic, what it shows very clearly is that at global level, the total amount of resource use, extraction of energy and resources of the environment, and also the extent to which we depend on nature to process the waste and emissions from our economy has never been larger in the past than it is today. Never in the past have we been extracting so many natural resources from the environment, so much energy from the environment. We have never been as dependent as we are today, or we have never been exploiting, if I may use this metaphor that we use in ecological economics, of natural capital than we are today, okay? Cities has allowed us to emancipate from nature, but only locally and partially, okay? Cities seems independent from nature, not because they do not depend on nature, but because they depend on enormous amount of territories for their daily supplies that go very much beyond the physical boundaries of the city. Studies of ecological footprints have found that the ecological footprint of a city, and this means, for those of you who might not be familiar with the concept, this means the amount of land on which we depend to supply all the food, energy, materials, etc. that we consume in the city, but also to absorb all our wastes and all our emissions, is typically between 500 and 1,000 times the size of the city area itself, okay? So first message to start, we do not depend on nature less than we did in the past, although we depend on nature differently, and cities have the ability to shift costs towards other regions and towards the future, okay? Good, given this introduction, let me then go ahead to introduce the key idea around which this presentation revolves. Is the notion that nature is not only important as an end in itself, which it is. Nature has intrinsic values, and in my opinion, also a right to exist by itself. But besides that, it also has what we could call instrumental or utilitarian values. Nature is not something only beautiful and having, you know, intrinsic and aesthetic values. It has also utilitarian values. It's the very material foundation of life, okay? We depend on nature to have, not only to live, but also to have a good life, okay? The concept that has been increasingly being used in the literature to understand this human dependence on ecological life support systems is the idea of ecosystem services that we can express quite simply as the benefits human derive from nature, okay? Let me put a little example. An urban tree plays many functions and provides many benefits to humans. Obviously, as many of you will know, it produces, for instance, aesthetic benefits. For those of you that do not live like me in Norway, but for instance, in a place like Turkey or in Spain, the place where I grew up, you will also be aware of the importance of trees in local climate regulation through shading and through providing humidity to the air through processes of evapotranspiration, okay? It is also, in many cases, especially old trees, habitat for many species, and especially for insects and many other types of biodiversity. But they also contribute to building sense of place and community. They also play a role in reducing, in buffering, likelihood for floods by, absorbing storms and so on. It can also contribute to lower the levels of noise. Trees and their leaves have the ability to absorb the waves of the sound and so on. So it can also reduce noise pollution, and not least, it can reduce air pollution. So trees are absorbing pollutants from the air and processing them, okay? So these single trees that we see just as something nice is actually doing lots of good stuff for us in the city. Let me introduce very briefly this concept of ecosystem services for those of you that might be less familiar with it. As I said, it's an umbrella concept that we use to cover all those benefits human derive from the environment. These include quite obviously things like food, fresh water, materials, wood, medicines, etc. But also many things that come from indirect benefits that we obtain from the regulation processes of nature. So ecosystems contribute to regulate the climate through carbon sequestration, purify water through the root systems, etc. To pollination, to make viable agriculture and so on, and also through the root systems to avoid the erosion of soils, okay? Just to give some examples. But it also provides many so-called cultural services, which refer to the intangible benefits we obtain from ecosystems, from our interaction with ecosystems. These cover things like tourism and recreation, but also the aesthetic benefits we derive from nature, through aspects such as spirituality. No? This is maybe less obvious in secular societies, but for animistic societies where spirituality is deeply intertwined with nature, this is something that is, again, very important. And it's not entirely absent also in a European context, for instance. No? You also have kind of New Age philosophies and the use of nature as a place for contemplation, for relaxation, etc., that is also intertwined with spiritual dimensions. Not least, you have the so-called supporting and habitat services. In a sense, those that underpin all other ecosystem services, and that include things like habitat of species and the maintenance of genetic diversity. One of the reasons why ecosystem services have been the subject of much attention in urban studies is because it's increasingly recognized that ecosystem services can contribute to so-called nature-based solutions. This is, again, one of the buzzwords that those people working in my field will find nowadays. They refer to actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. I'm giving here the definition from IUCN. So increasingly, a narrative is built around the idea that ecosystem services and nature-based solutions can be important drivers towards the transformations needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and most importantly, for the sake of our discussion today, Sustainable Development Goal 11, of making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Let us put some examples on how this plays out in the concrete cases of cities, ecosystem services in cities. Well, first of all, start with these so-called provisioning services. As you all know, cities do not have in principle a productive vocation in terms of agriculture and so on. This is something that in most cases we do outside the cities, in the countryside, okay? And still agriculture in peri-urban areas, green roofs, allotment gardens, and community gardens is in many parts of the world a very important activity. More than 600 million people around the world are actually people that are practicing urban agriculture. In particular parts of the world, this, the contribution of urban agriculture to local supplies can be extremely high. I give you some cases like Dakar, Dar es Salaam, Phnom Penh, Hanoi, Vientiane, where quite often more than 50% of the vegetables that are consumed in the city comes from urban agriculture. In Habana, in Cuba, data from Altieri that are already a little bit old, but also show that urban agriculture is an important part of local supplies. And this was critically important, for instance, for the resilience of Cuban cities after the collapse of the Soviet Union. As you may know, Cuba is a country that basically was producing only sugar, sending to Russia or to the Soviet Union all the sugar, and getting in exchange all other kinds of things they needed. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, this country could have gone through very serious problems of food security and so on, which they managed to buffer to a large extent by ambitious programs of urban agriculture. So one thing that is important to note here is that even if under normal circumstances, you know, the food supplies from urban agriculture can be seen to be marginal, in particular historical moments of crisis like wars or economic crisis, when, you know, supply chains suddenly collapse. This was also the case, partly is being the case with the COVID pandemic. In those cases, ability to supply for basic goods locally can turn to be critically important. This is what we witnessed, for instance, during wars, during which, for instance, urban agriculture has become a matter of government propaganda. You know, these things this picture I'm showing you here is people planting potatoes in front of the Reichstag, the parliament of Germany. And what you find in the right side is government propaganda, war propaganda, asking people to actually be active in urban agriculture. So even if in normal times, this can be seen as a marginal activity, in times of crisis, it can be a very important source of resilience for cities. Moving on to the so-called regulating services, here we can put some examples like noise attenuation, okay? The classical engineering solution for problems of noise pollution is based on built infrastructure, okay? We create long walls that go along the highway to protect and to create a buffer against noise pollution. Well, in many parts of the world, they have realized that a very effective way of dealing with this problem can be not relying on built infrastructure, but relying on so-called green infrastructure, relying on, you know, planting trees, for instance, in order to absorb and deviate and reflect the sound waves and thereby reducing noise pollution. It's also well known that urban vegetation plays an important role in urban cooling, or if you want, microclimate regulation. Okay, this is not least important in order to buffer the so-called urban heat island effects that derive from the emissions and the heating mechanisms that we have in cities. No, so it regulates temperature through shading, but also through evapotranspiration, through the humidity that goes out from the leaves of the trees. Okay, trees also increase the level of albedo, okay, reflect the sun radiation and thereby reduces the absorption of heat by sealed surfaces. Other examples, one that is very important and that is actually already to some extent incorporated into many urban management plans is the role of vegetation in mitigating runoff, you know, in mitigate or in flood prevention, if I can put it that way. So vegetation, as you will know, facilitates water percolation, and cities with 50 to 90% of paved surface lose between 40 and 80% of water runoff, okay? Meaning that the more percentage of your city you cover with concrete, that you don't leave natural soils there, the more problems you will have with flooding, unless you find all the kinds of engineering based solutions, okay? Another important aspect here, something that came very much into the media after Hurricane Katrina, for instance, in the US, is the role that green infrastructure can play in protecting coastal cities. As we have been destroying mangroves, coral reefs, and other natural barriers that were protecting the coasts, now each time we have a climate extreme like a tsunami, a hurricane, a storm, etc., can have devastating effects on the coastal populations, okay? Because we have destroyed this kind of green infrastructure that was protecting us. This is increasingly important now in the context of climate change, where the intensity, frequency, and unpredictability of climate extremes is expected to increase. Another example I did not include here, but that I will discuss later, is the role of urban vegetation in removing pollutants from the air. When it comes to the so-called cultural services, these intangible benefits we get from nature, well, recreation is one of them. We have now just submitted a paper where we do a study that covers many countries, documenting the importance of urban nature during the confinements, during the COVID. We found empirical evidence that people that have not had access to urban green spaces during the confinement has had statistically significant larger health problems than people that had access to green spaces, either privately by gardens and so on, or to parks and other public green spaces. So here you also have an element of justice, because we also found correlation between socioeconomic status and ability to access green spaces that, of course, has political implications. Not less important is the aesthetic benefits we get from urban nature. Many of us, stressed by daily urban life, we like to, you know, lose ourselves and sit down in a bank to enjoy, you know, the landscapes and the tranquility of nature. And for instance, one thing that is also being increasingly studied is the importance of nature in the cognitive development of kids. Kids that are allowed to be in nature and to experiment in nature. This provides multiple opportunities for learning, exploration, etc. As I said, especially among children. Okay, this was the general picture. How does this sort of becomes more concrete? Maybe now I will bore you a little bit more with numbers, and but basically I want to show you that this is not just sort of a new jargon or a bundle of metaphors. It's something that we can use in very tangible ways. We can quantify, we can measure, and we can use also to inform urban planning processes, okay? I will show you here some examples from the time I was based in Barcelona some years back, where I was coordinating a small research group working on urban ecology and urban ecosystem services. Barcelona is indeed an interesting case to look at the role of the links between urban green space and human well-being, because it's a very densely inhabited city, okay? 1.6 million people living within about 10,000 hectares. So we have a density, a population density of around 160 inhabitants per hectare, okay? We have a very limited urban green space that is less than 7 square meters per inhabitant. The recommendations that come from health authorities in the European Union, the World Health Organization, and so on, recommends levels of at least but hopefully more, no less than 10 square meters per inhabitant, meaning that it's a city that is not fulfilling the basic requirements recommended by health authorities of green space. I think it has also been the case. This is why, for instance, when development projects affect green space in the city of Barcelona, it has been the source of environmental conflicts. The Turkish people in the audience know about this because some years back you had a very strong environmental conflict linked to this attempt that maybe was complete in the end, of replacing one of the last standing urban parks in the middle of Istanbul by a shopping center. No, this was a quite serious conflict that happened some years back. So I think some of you know the kind of thing I'm talking about. Let me start talking about regulating services from urban forest in Barcelona. What we did here was to look at the role that urban forests played in absorbing and processing a set of air pollutants, things like the ones you see on screen, from particulate matter to carbon dioxides, to ozone, and to nitrogen and sulfur dioxides, okay? But also the extent to which is capturing and sequestering and storing carbon in order to mitigate climate change. Well, using a model called I3 that we used, it was developed by the US Forest Service, that were so kind to receive our data and run the model. We managed to quantify air purification by urban forest in Barcelona. What you see here is the monthly and annual air pollution removal by air pollutant. Okay, how much we're getting of each of the 5 pollutants I was mentioning before. On the left side of the screen, you can see the biophysical accounts. So basically, how many tons of each type of pollutants are being removed by the trees over throughout the year. Some of you may be thinking, why do these values change so much from December to May or June when you have the maximums? Well, the obvious is relatively straightforward. It's because, and that in the winter, in this type of climate, the trees lose their leaves and then they are no longer absorbing pollutants, okay? This has implications because sometimes if you want, for instance, to keep air pollution going on during the winter, you will also have to put trees that do not lose their leaves during the winter. What you see on the other side of the screen is the monetary values you can attribute. This is, of course, a controversial practice, whether or not we can monetize or not these things. But as a matter of fact, it is very widely done. And basically what we are looking here is what kind of values can you attribute to these ecosystem services in monetary terms. You may be saying, how can you do this? Well, it's complex. I cannot explain you all the details, but so just to give you an idea, one of the ways we quantify the economic value of air purification by nature is by looking at how much health costs we are avoiding in terms of avoided respiratory disease. Disease that, if treated in the hospital, will have a cost, either privately or publicly, depending on whether or not the health system is private. So it's a way you can use to quantify the amount of money this is saving to people and to public budgets, okay? What you see here in this other slide is by each pollutant, how many tons we are removing from each pollutant, what is the economic value, etc. Now, when you look at these numbers, isolated, they look very nice. We're removing, 166 tons of particulate matter from the air and so on. But I also have to disappoint you a little bit to tell you that when you compare these relatively substantial amounts of pollution removal with the actual amounts of pollution produced by cities, then these numbers are no longer so impressive, okay? In the case of carbon sequestration and other pollutants, it's often less than 1% of the total pollution produced by the city that urban nature is able to process and remove. For other pollutants, however, the contribution can be much higher. So for instance, in the case of particulate matter, which is very important in terms of causing respiratory disease, here it has been, many studies show, and our study in Barcelona shows that more than 20% of these pollutions can be removed by the trees. And if you have a good design of your green infrastructure and you put these trees along you know, the venues where you have the cars and so on, the level of effectiveness can be substantially increased. Let me put now another example of links between human health and green spaces in cities, again, in the case of Barcelona. As you may know, in Spain, the economic crisis of the financial crisis of 2008 hit very strongly, because it was a mixture of the global financial crisis and a local national crisis stemming from the burst of a housing bubble. So Spain was really in deep trouble in these years. You had unemployment rates of up till 50% among the youth. So suddenly we also see in these years lots of people with lots of time because they do not have access to a job, and they start doing other things. One of the things we see over these years is the mushrooming, the blooming of urban gardening initiatives, okay? There were very few before these times, and then suddenly you see, as maybe it's a little bit small, but in the right side of the screen, you can see all these urban gardens that started to appear over those years around the city, okay? Here I show you some of these community and allotment gardens in Barcelona. Some of them are formally established top-down by government authorities, by local authorities, by city councils and so on. Others are more informal. They emerged from local initiatives of, you know, neighborhoods. Sometimes even it's occupying idle land, you know, brown fields in the city and so on, that are occupied by social movements or by neighborhoods, and they start putting together these community gardens, okay? Well, in this particular case, trying to look at the monetary values or the biophysical amounts of food produced by these gardens, you may not get very sort of interesting figures. Urban gardens is something that, because of their very limited size as compared, for instance, to urban and peri-urban forest, the amounts, the quantities you can assign to these services can be quite modest if you measure them in biophysical or monetary terms. However, they may have very high social and cultural value. So here a different approach was used that will be again familiar to some people in the audience, that the so-called leakage scales, where we ask people, we use qualitative scales to see what is the relative importance people give to different types of ecosystem services produced by urban gardens. One result we got from this study is that it's somewhat counterintuitive, right? We think of urban gardens as agriculture and then as producing mainly food. Well, what we found, for instance, in this study is that if food production was a very highly valued ecosystem service, it is the green line in the upper side of the slide. What we found is that it was these cultural services, these intangible services, put in red in the graph, those that were most widely perceived and most highly valued by the users, okay? So things like the role of the engagement in urban gardens play, for instance, in learning and education. You know, in cities, we go to the supermarket, we have everything we want any time of the year, and we lose awareness of the local ecological cycles. What can we produce locally at each time of the year? People that engage themselves in these urban gardening initiatives start getting an understanding of what you can actually produce each time of the year in the place where you live, okay? Without importing so many things from very distant parts of the world with very large ecological footprints, okay? Another thing is that people perceive this was a very important driver of social cohesion and integration. One of the great paradoxes of cities, I guess someone will be talking about this in the conference, is that they are so densely populated and still there is so much loneliness in cities, okay? We live isolated with this kind of architecture we developed not so long ago, where we have decided that people have to be living alone or with their core families, rather than in places where we have more possibilities for exchange and socialization. Well, in this case, community gardens have played a very important role for people that maybe have limited opportunities for socializations, and community gardens become a very important driver of putting people to do things together, and hence to create sense of place and sense of community. I could also refer to how this is important, for instance, for physical and for mental health, when again, one of the urban challenges is obesity and all these disease associated to our sedentary lifestyles, okay? Just to put some example of benefits. Hishret, I don't know how well I'm doing with time, but if I'm talking too long, give me a hands up and I will summarize, but I'm moving towards the end now.
Okay, we have around 20 minutes more.
Ah, wonderful. Okay, I will try to leave some space for discussion though. Let us now move to another level. So far I've been talking to assessment, how can we measure this and so on. We're still talking more at the scientific assessment level, okay? But can this be actually useful for decision makers, for people, for planners, for people that are, you know, with the hands in the mud, dealing with the daily problems of cities at the management level? My experience with my research group in Barcelona, and with interaction with local policymakers and planners, is that actually they are interested in this kind of data, and they were willing to articulate our data into their urban planning and into their management plans. I will explain you now, give you some examples of how this has been done. Again, I will put the example of Barcelona, but here note in the map that we are moving to a different scale. What I showed you in the previous examples is what happens in the Municipality of Barcelona. This is what we find in gray in the sort of coastal. So, you know, if you look at the map, you have a forest along the sea, but then at the left of this forest, you will find a big gray area. This is the Municipality of Barcelona. Now I'm zooming back to the larger metropolitan region of Barcelona. That again is very interesting because it's tremendously heavily populated in terms of density and so on. Well, what we will look now is again at ecosystem services provided by green spaces within this region. Okay. Sorry if I come with a little bit technical data in this slide, but I think it's important that you follow this explanation so that you can better understand and interpret the data I will be showing in the next slides. Okay, so please keep your attention, although this is a little technical. This is one of the ways we have been used, one of the models we have been using to understand or to disentangle, if I may use that expression, the links between urban green spaces and human well-being. What you see here in the green, blue, and red boxes is basically the ecological system in the left, the social system in the right, and this notion of ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people as the thing that is linking people and nature, that is linking nature to human well-being, okay? It's important to understand here the different things involved in this chain that, in a sense, if I may use the metaphor, it looks almost like a commodity change, no? What happens from the extraction from the ecosystem to the final service that is enjoyed by people. The way we often portray this as understanding ecosystems, looking here with ecological lens, natural scientist lens, as a set of biophysical structures and processes that underpin a number of ecosystem services that creates benefits and values to people. People may be thinking, well, what's the difference between a service and a benefit? Well, in the technical domain in which we're dealing this, we make this differentiation because the service is what nature provides, but the benefit is what we get in the end, not only from the contribution of nature, but by mixing the contribution of nature with other types of not only natural capital, but human-made capital, okay? It's not enough that nature is out there. If you want people to enjoy nature, for instance, for recreation, you must make that nature accessible. You must have, ways that allow people to penetrate that nature. You must have maybe some minimum infrastructure that allow people to sit around, to enjoy this nature, etc. Okay, sometimes you can only turn this free gift from nature into an actual benefit if you incorporate some, labor or build capital into the process. Well, I want you to keep these three boxes in mind, because now we will look at three different dimensions involved in the generation and use of ecosystem services. On the one hand, we have the capacity, okay? The capacity is the potential amount of benefits of ecosystem services a natural system can provide. It depends on its natural characteristics, okay? For instance, how much water can we extract from a system? If your city, for instance, depends on underground water, it will depend on the volume of the aquifer you have there and its regeneration rate, okay? This is the potential. Doesn't mean that you are using all the water you have there. All the water represents the potential, but another thing is the flow. The flow is the actual amount you are using. In this case, in the example of the underground aquifer that will provide water to the city, the flow is the amount of water we are extracting, okay? Now, you may find, for instance, that the flow, the actual amount of water you are extracting from the system is not enough to cover the total demand from water. So maybe the city will also be depending on, large infrastructures to collect water from more distant areas into the city. This means that not always the flow manages to cover the demand. Why am I devoting a little bit of time to these technicalities? Because it's important. It's what exactly makes this type of framework useful for urban planning. Because if we have a situation where the flow is higher than the capacity, it means that we are using the ecosystem in an unsustainable way. Think, for instance, again, of the example of the aquifer. The aquifer, as you know, are systems that, unless they are isolated, this depends on the geology of the system, but unless they are isolated, they will usually have inputs of water and outputs of water, okay? If you are extracting water more rapidly than the regeneration rate of the aquifer, than the natural rhythms of replenishing itself, or in other words, if the flow is higher than the capacity, you are using the system in an unsustainable way, okay? First lesson for urban planning. Again, what happens if the demand is higher than the flow? This means that here you have an unsatisfied demand. So for instance, and here the concept of demand can be a bit tricky. Don't think of demand necessarily in individual terms in a market context, okay? One way of thinking of demand in this particular case, dealing with public goods and so on, is how can we measure the demand for for green spaces in a city? Well, one option is to make surveys and ask people around if they want more or less parks. But another pragmatic approach can be to use policy targets as an indicator of societal demand. As I mentioned some slides earlier, one indicator that is used as a policy target is green space per inhabitant. And health authorities are recommending that people should have, to have a good life, should have no less than 10 square meters of green space per inhabitant, okay? In the case of Barcelona, the flow that would be represented for the actual amount of green space per inhabitant does not meet the demand. if we compare it with the recommendation of the health authorities. Again, why is this important? Because, for instance, if a municipality, if a city council has a limited amount of money, a certain budget for restoring green spaces in the city, it can be interesting to, this kind of studies can be interesting to target those areas of the city where there is, you know, a deficit of the supply of a given ecosystem service, so that you can eventually match the demand. I hope you are being able to follow my explanation. When we find these situations where flow is higher than demand or where demand is higher than flow, we talk about ecosystem services mismatches. This concept is appreciated by policymakers because we are pointing at the places where we have problems we have to deal with, problems that needs attention from decision-making processes. And this is why this is important for management and planning. I'm giving you now concrete examples on how we have put this into practice. What I'm showing you in this slide is air purification pumps for Barcelona, okay? Remember that we express the supply, the capacity in green and the demand in red. Where do you expect to be the capacity for air purification? Well, basically in those places where you have vegetation, okay? So these are the places that we find in green. And where do we expect to have the demand? Well, we expect to have the demand, first of all, where people live, otherwise you have no demand, but also in those places where there is more pollution. So we have them mostly in the city centers. This is what we find in the lower left side of the slide. So basically, where is that we find this mismatch, this unsatisfied demand? Well, in the city center of Barcelona is where we have a very high demand for air purification, but not enough urban vegetation to meet this demand, okay? Here I show you another example, which is recreation. Again, you see that the potential, the capacity for recreation comes from those places where we have lots of nature, forests, etc. But the demand comes from the city itself, because it's where people are actually demanding this access to recreational areas and so on. So where it is again, and unsurprisingly, where we find the mismatch and the unsatisfied demand in the densely populated urban cores with poor amounts of urban green space. Why can this be relevant, for instance, for urban planning and economic policy? What I'm showing you in this other slide is an urban-rural gradient, okay? I'm looking at these four variables I showed you in the previous slide. You can see in the legend in the right side of the screen, capacity, flow, demand, and unsatisfied demand. And what we have here is a gradient that goes from the very city center of Barcelona and 50 kilometers away from the city center. The pattern that you find for both outdoor recreation and air purification is the same, okay? You find that in the city center, there is very low supply or very low capacity because you have very little green space, and very high demand because you have lots of people demanding these benefits, okay? As you go more and more far from the city center, you go to or if we look at the other extreme of the graph, we have places much more far away from the city where you have lots of nature and few people. So you have more capacity than, demand. Whereas you find that those places where you have a match between the capacity and the supply are those places of intermediate population levels, okay? Here is where somehow you find a balance between the amount of local supply of nature and ecosystem services and the social demand for it. I'm not implying here that we need to have, these matches should be the overall guidance for urban planning. Sometimes we do not need to satisfy all our demands locally. We can import them from other places. We can import food in cities. We can, pay through certain mechanisms and through offsetting schemes, we can pay people in other parts of the world to offset our emissions. But there are things we cannot import. We cannot import, for instance, local climate regulation. For that, we need to have ecosystem services on place, okay? Again, I think this is relevant for two things. One thing that shows these graphs is that even if you know the intuitive thing is that through rural subsidies and so on, subsidies to agriculture, is the city that is financially subsidizing the countryside. What this graph shows is that, yes, this is true, but also the countryside is subsidizing the city, not in financial terms, but in ecological terms, through the provision of ecosystem services, okay? This is important because it can give basis for policy instruments such as payments for ecosystem services. This is something that is applied already in many countries where people from the city pay people from the countryside for the services they are producing for the city, water supply and other things, okay? And it's also important as a redistribution mechanism because, as you know, increasingly wealth and capital and power is concentrating in cities and more far away from the countryside. It can also be a way of designing and informing the establishment of environmental taxes, environmental subsidies, and so on. So it has actually lots of practical applications. Actually, this type of methodologies have awakened interest beyond Barcelona, and we have ended up applying it to a whole range of cities throughout Europe, to Stockholm, to Salzburg, to Rotterdam, to Berlin, etc. And again, we find we are able, by using these tools that I have been presenting, to quantify the supply, the flow, and the demand of different ecosystem services, identify the mismatches, and try to provide inputs for policymakers on how we can deal with these problems. Again, here I come with a little bit technical slide, but I think you will get the intuitive idea. What are the limits of these models? Well, sometimes these dynamics can be very complex and sometimes they are non-linear. Okay, so one of the things in which we are trying to work at the moment is how can we incorporate non-linearities into these models? Sorry for this obscure jargon. I will explain what I mean in a moment. Often we assume, for instance, that the more vegetation we have and the more pollution we have, the more pollution removal vegetation will do. This is true, but only to a certain extent. Beyond a certain threshold, beyond a certain level of pollution in the air, beyond a certain threshold of concentration of pollution in the air, the plants, in order to protect themselves from pollution, will close their stomata. And at that point, they will no longer be providing this service. So if you reach certain critical levels of pollution, the provision of this ecosystem service can actually collapse. To put an example in the societal domains, if we think, for instance, of recreation, just to keep exemplifying with the data I have been showing so far, we have a little bit the same situation, no? The more people that are using green space, the higher the flow. The more you can say this ecosystem service is being used. But at some point, you will have a problem of congestion. After a certain threshold, the amount of people you are concentrating in a green space can be so high that people do no longer feel this kind of relaxation or, you know, this kind of contemplation and other things they would do if it was not collapsed with people. So when you reach that point, again, the value of the service will decline. We're thinking at the moment how we can incorporate these dynamics to make these models even more reliable. Coming to an end, let me make some concluding remarks about what we have been discussing so far. To put things in very simple terms, protecting, enhancing, and restoring green infrastructure, and with green infrastructure, I mean these green spaces in cities that are actively managed to promote the provision of ecosystem services, offers multiple opportunities for improving well-being, health, and resilience in cities. Still, ecosystem services are incorporated into urban planning processes into a quite limited extent, although some cities are already taking this seriously and incorporating them into their plans. Effective design of green infrastructure or urban green space involve clear understanding of the scales at which ecosystem services are produced and the scale at which the benefits accrue, okay? I was saying that maybe we can solve problems like food supply or carbon emissions by importing these things from elsewhere. We import food from long distance, we pay people in the Amazon to offset our carbon emissions. But in some cases, you do not have this possibility. I was putting the example of local climate regulation. You cannot import local climate regulation from ecosystems elsewhere. If you also want to have, for instance, water supply, you can again not depend on, you depend on watersheds that are physically not so far from the city. Some ecosystem services you can just import from other places. Others, if you want to fulfill their function for human well-being, you will have to recreate them locally, okay? Now, I also want to flag here a point of attention. Sometimes we oversimplify these narratives. We say, you know, nature provides nature-based solutions, etc. This will fix urban challenges, this will fix our problems, etc. Is this true? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. For some urban challenges, ecosystem services and green spaces can provide very effective responses. It's very effective, for instance, the use of urban green spaces to deal with problems of stress, solitude, or other kind of challenges we find in the city. But the type of data I've been showing here today, I'm so sorry because someone there's a lot of noise suddenly outside my place. I'm sort of doing home office because of the COVID. I hope you are not listening it too much. I'm afraid you will be listening to it. Sorry, I can't do anything about it. I hope it won't last too long. If we think, for instance, of the problem of air pollution, what I showed you before is that you won't fix this problem by planting trees in a city. Yes, if you plant trees for people to have recreation and to protect biodiversity, one co-benefit of this, one side effect will be some removal of air pollution. But as I showed you with data of Barcelona that are also confirmed with studies elsewhere, often the amount of pollution we can remove through urban vegetation amounts to less than 1% of the total pollution produced by the city. In this case, looking at the sink level, you know, the sinks of this pollution is not the effective way of dealing with the problem. If you want to deal seriously with the problem of air pollution in a city, nature won't give you the solution. You will have to work at the source level. You will have to limit emissions. You will have to disincentivize or cap the amount of use of private car in the city, and you will have to incentivize and subsidize green options for transportation and so on. Finally, another sort of take-home message that I learned from my experience interacting with policymakers in Barcelona. One of the big limitations we found in Barcelona for an effective governance of green infrastructure had to do with these administrative silos, okay? This is my domain of competence. We deal with this. Beyond these administrative borders, it's no longer our business. Other people, other authorities deal with this. We have limited communication and so on. Ecosystem services do not listen to administrative limits, okay? They depend on ecological dynamics, ecological processes, and ecological structures that extends across geographical scales, okay? If we want to have an effective governance of green infrastructure, we need multi-level governance systems where authorities at different levels talk to each other and coordinate with each other in order to understand that sometimes ecosystem services depend on ecosystems that extend across two administrative scales. Listen not only to the scale of administration, listen also to the scales of ecology. I've run out of time, so I will finish here with quotes of two people I admire very much. They are Patrick Gettys and Louis Mumford, in my opinion, two of the most interesting visionaries of the ecological city. people that have the ability to think outside the box, I think much more than we are able to do today, and that had a vision of radically different ways of understanding how to organize a city. I think they are worth reading, and I always ask my students, go back to these old books because you can learn a lot from them. Patrick Geddes said, this is a green world with animals comparatively few and small, and all dependent upon the leaves. By leaves, we live. I also like this other quote from Lewis Mumford, who said, forget the damn motor car and build cities for lovers and for friends. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm here for any doubts or questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Erik, for your insightful keynote speech. Unfortunately, we are out of time and we don't have any time for discussion and further questions. It was really insightful and informative, although I am not familiar with the technical details. Now green spaces are a part and parcel of our daily lives, and especially during these difficult times with the pandemic. So thank you very much for your participation to the 5th Conference of Urban Studies. We hope to develop our collaboration for the future events and meetings. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just thanking you, Hishret, thanking the conference organizer, and thanking the audience for their attention. This time we had to meet online. Hopefully, if time gets better in the future, we may have a chance to meet in person. I wish you all the best and a very productive and interesting conference of what remains of it. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.